All right, good morning, everybody. So I'm going to attempt to give you a 60-minute blockchain presentation in about 7 minutes. So I'll talk a little fast and we'll cover some questions at the end. Let's see here. As Chuck mentioned, I work in emerging technology for the National Pork Board. I'm really looking across the value chain on how technology is going to disrupt how we do traditional business. So everything from kind of farm to table. And one of those things is, of course, blockchain. And so really what I'm seeing over the last 6 months is this convergence of three macro themes driven by technology. And it's this changing consumer behavior. As Jane and Christine both mentioned, their preferences are changing, driven by some of the millennials. You have a new term called flexitarians, which I just learned a few weeks ago. That's really driving change. And then you throw a mobile phone in their pocket. And so that combination is really interesting to us. We have emerging technologies coming out. These things are getting cheaper every day. And I joke when I talk about this a lot that it used to take a supercomputer to run some of these machine learning and AI, artificial intelligence, algorithms. And now you can do that with a chip on your mobile phone in your pocket. And so the acceleration of these technologies and the pace of which the change is coming is interesting. And then you look at disruptive models. We have Uber going IPO tomorrow, and about 10 years ago, they didn't exist, and that business model didn't exist. And you see that with Airbnb, similarly with the hospitality industry. And so we see kind of those disruptive models coming into the food and ag system. So really this kind of convergence of these three macro trends is the spot where we think there's potential for innovation. And that's why we're talking about blockchain today, and that's why we're talking about some of these other hot topics. So I'll give you a second to read this, but again, we're talking about these things in many cases because they're going to affect our industry, but in many cases it's very much buzzworthy. And I joke that a lot of us are talking about blockchain just to be talking about blockchain, and I'll be realistic with you that that's probably why we're talking about it. And that's the same with artificial intelligence. It's kind of an unknown, but we're going to get to a point where we aren't going to talk about blockchain. It's just going to be a thing that we all work on. And it's going to be a protocol that's underlying how we move products around. And if you think about the phone in your pocket, the Facebook app, that runs on an operating system, that runs on a network protocols. And we don't talk about those network protocols anymore. And that's where blockchain is heading. It's just going to be a thing, and there's going to be several abstraction layers built on top of it. And so in a few years, it's not going to be the buzzword. It's just going to be a thing we all talk about. Here's a flow chart I like to hand out when I give this talk. So again, it's buzzworthy. 95% of the time, no, you do not need a blockchain. A traditional database can do the job for you. A traditional interface of how companies exchange data can do the job for you. But there are a few cases where blockchain makes sense. A lot of those cases are in the financial markets, and a lot of those cases are in supply chains, and we all work in supply chains, so that's why we're talking about it. So what is blockchain? I'm going to boil down a kind of highly technical product into a few items here. It's just a database. It's a ledger, a distributed ledger. And so you guys all familiar with ledgers. You use them almost every day, probably using Microsoft Excel. You take that model and you distribute that Excel file. Maybe it's now a Google Sheet. Now everybody can work on that and everybody can exchange that data in real time. And so now it's distributed and it's decentralized. It doesn't live on your computer or my computer. It lives across all of those computers in different nodes. And we can share that data in real time. It's immutable. So you take that Google Sheet that you guys collaborate on, but nobody can go back to row one and change the data. And so that's what the immutability means. In a traditional database system, coming from the IT world, you can log into a database and change data. The system administrator can just go in and change it. And if you're looking at changing data through a supply chain and there's a loophole there where I can go change that data that we're exchanging, that creates a big problem. And of course, it's all encrypted. So all the data that goes in there is cryptographically signed with a lot of math that I do not understand, but it is encrypted. Another key point here that's missing that I talk about in the longer talk is that what we're really talking about are private blockchains. You guys are all probably familiar with Bitcoin, which is a public blockchain, and those terms often get tangled together, and really they're separate. Bitcoin runs on a public blockchain, so you can go out and look at every Bitcoin transaction that's ever happened. Anybody in the public can go look at that. In supply chain terms, these blockchains are private. You are granting people access into these systems. It's not like anybody in the public can go out and look at this supply chain and go poke at every single piece of detail. A, it's encrypted, and B, you have to have permission to get in. So a lot of the blockchain that we'll talk about are these permissioned ledgers. So this is a blockchain. I just want to demystify this. It's not some sexy silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. It's literally ones and zeros. These are on files that are exchanged again across the network. So it's not anything fancy. It's just data. And you can see there that you can't read any of that data because it is encrypted with a hash. And how blockchains work is they take a block of, it's literally a chain of blocks. You take a data, you write it to a block, and you create another block next to it, and that creates a chain. And that chain you can go back in history and see, and nobody can change that again because it's immutable. So we can't go back in time and fudge any data. So why are we talking about this in food and agriculture? And so that we see four things. We have provenance, traceability, trust, and efficiency. With provenance, it's really an origin story. Where did this product come from? And that's an important thing as we look at that changing consumer preference. And then even within the supply chain, I'll talk about a couple of use cases here where that's an issue. Traceability, that's just built on top of that origin. Okay, we know where the product came from, but then where did it go before it got to the retail or food service location? Trust, there's an authenticity issue in food. Are those eggs really cage-free or vegetarian-fed? Is this meat really antibiotic-free? Can the consumer trust this? Can the food service buyer trust this? And all these label claims. And then efficiencies. As we move data around, we have transactional efficiencies when we work on these real-time distributed ledgers. So you can see paper going away. You can see some contracts codified into what we call smart contracts in the blockchain ecosystem, where we can facilitate a transaction when a new block is written. So I'm going to run through a few case studies real quick. Bumblebee Foods is tracking tuna on a blockchain. And so this goes back to that authenticity and trust. There's a huge trust problem in the seafood market. And so you could go to a sushi place in New York and think you're getting this high-end cut, and the chef might think that you're getting the high-end cut, but you're really getting a fraudulent piece of meat. And so that's a big problem in seafood. So they think that blockchain can solve this, and they can tell that story all the way to that food service institution of where that tuna came from and that it's really a tuna. You probably all heard the Walmart story. By the end of 2020, they'll mandate blockchain use within their leafy green supply chain. This is an interesting case for two reasons. It's a food safety issue and it's a food waste issue. So when there's a lettuce out or an E. coli in lettuce, they have to throw away all their lettuce. In a case of blockchain, they can just throw away the lettuce that is contaminated or followed a specific path. And so there's a food safety issue as you're not getting contaminated lettuce out, and there's an efficiency issue there of being able to trace that back. And so the quick story is how Walmart got into this was Frank Giannis, who's their VP of food safety, who's now at the FDA, kind of walked in their office and said, here's a package of mangoes, tell me where they came from. And it took about 6 days for them to do that. They piloted a solution with IBM on blockchain, and it took two and a half seconds. So if you look at that from a potential cost issue, they just saved a lot of money by knowing exactly which mangoes to throw away, and then they did that much faster so not as many people could get sick. IBM, like I just said, is kind of building this platform. They call it Food Trust. It's built on an open source blockchain platform, and so they're really building the platform for other food companies to tap into. Beef Chain, you might have heard of them. It's a group of Wyoming ranchers. They think that they can afford a premium back to the rancher by putting specific data about the cattle that's in the system, and then they run it through a packing plant that's specifically set up with a line for their product, and they're going to go out to retail, and they're using a USDA process verified program, and they're taking that process verified program and writing that data to a blockchain to expose all the way out into a consumer package and label. Tyson's doing something similar using DNA. You've probably seen Cargill's Honeysuckle brand over the last couple of Thanksgivings. They have a QR code on a package. Consumers can go up with their mobile phone, take a picture of that code, and it'll trace that turkey back to the farm where it came from and tell the farmer's story about that turkey. Chinese have been doing this for a couple years. There's an example right there with the QR code on the label. If you take a picture of that, it pops up a smartphone app from the retailer, which is JD.com, which is kind of like Amazon.com in China, and that tells you the story of the cow where that beef came from, where the product went, the cow's name and weight, and any antibiotics it might have had. And the last quick example here is California is putting their groundwater on blockchain. So they're tokenizing water and giving the farmers through irrigation systems access to that, and you have specific rations. But then you can trade these tokens. If your neighbor needs more water, you can trade with them, or you can potentially get into a hedging situation where you can buy up all these tokens, which I think is an interesting model. But with that, thank you, and we'll take questions.